Hi, and welcome to a special GCSE history lesson. In this lesson, we will recap what we have learnt in Topic 1, the first 19 lessons of this course, which covered the ideas and events of the Cold War in Europe from 1943 until 1960. Then we'll have a look at some exam questions and answers. By the end of this lesson, you should understand and be able to explain the main ideologies of the Cold War, as well as the sequence of events from 1943 until 1960. You should also understand how to answer the different types of exam questions for the Edexcel GCSE exam. We will begin where we started, with the ideas of the Cold War. The ideas we have examined in this topic are communism, capitalism, democracy, one-party states, decolonisation, and socialism. We should remember that communism and the one-party state meant the government controlled the economy and politics within a country, while capitalism and democracy meant the people control the economy and politics. The USA and Western Europe were capitalist democracies, and the USSR and the East were generally communist one-party states. Socialism was a middle ground between communism and capitalism, because it allowed the government to control parts of the economy while not banning private ownership. Socialism was popular in Europe after World War II, but it was not popular in the USA or USSR, who preferred countries to subscribe to either capitalism or communism. Decolonisation was also a feature of the Cold War, where old empires fell away and new nation-states arose, especially in Africa and Asia. If you want to revisit these ideas in more depth, check out Lessons 1, 2 and 3, or Lesson 11, where we summarise these ideas together. Now, let's quickly recap the events of the Cold War from the middle of World War II onwards. By now, we should have a firm grasp of what happened in World War II. We should recall how the USA, UK and USSR were allies in 1943 and helped each other defeat Nazi Germany by 1945. But in 1945, the alliance began to sour. Between the Yalta Conference in February 1945 and the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, you should recall that the creation of the atomic bomb, communist governments in Eastern Europe, the death of Roosevelt, and other factors worsened Soviet-American relations. At the end of World War II, the relationship between the US and USSR worsened even further when the USA used nuclear bombs against Japan, and the USSR began its race to create one of its own. We saw by looking at two telegrams from the US and Soviet ambassadors sent in 1946 that the two superpowers saw each other as aggressive and threatening. After our recap in video 11, we started to look at the events of the Cold War after 1946. We saw that the USA developed a strategy to contain the USSR wherever it sought to spread its influence. This was adopted in the Truman Doctrine on March 12, 1947. Fears that communism might spread to Western Europe, which was poor and destroyed after the war, prompted the USA to introduce the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, announced on June 5, 1947. It became official policy on April 3, 1948, but Stalin would not allow his Eastern European states to join. On October 5, 1947, in response to the confusion created in Eastern Europe by the Marshall Plan, Stalin introduced Cominform, an organisation created to better organise communist parties across Europe. We saw that in 1948 and 1949, the deadlock on what to do with Germany could not be solved, and so the Western powers decided to create a government for West Germany. The decision to adopt a new West German currency on June 20, 1948 angered Stalin, who imposed a blockade on Berlin. From the 24th of June 1948 until 12th of May 1949, the British-American Berlin airlift supplied Berliners with basic necessities. Stalin's blockade eventually failed. After this, the Federal Republic of Germany was formed in the West on September 1st, 1949, and the German Democratic Republic in the East on October 7th, 1949. The two Germanys refused to recognise one another. During the Berlin Crisis on April 4, 1949, the USA signed a military alliance with Canada and 10 European countries, with the goal of deterring Soviet aggression. In January 1949, the USSR introduced Comecon to organise and make more efficient the communist economies in the East, which were falling behind Western Europe, backed by the Marshall Plan. By the end of the 40s, we also saw the beginning of the arms race between the USA and USSR, with the Soviets successfully testing their first nuclear bomb on August 29, 1949, along with the first intercontinental ballistic missile on August 12, 1949. So, by the year 1950, Europe and Germany had been divided into two camps, each under the influence of a nuclear superpower. The West was sponsored by the USA, and the East was under the influence of the USSR. Moving on to the 1950s, we saw the continuation of the arms race, first with the detonation of a hydrogen bomb in the USA on November 1st, 1952, and the Soviets detonating their own deliverable version on August 21st, 1953. You will also remember that on March 5th, 1953, Stalin died and was replaced by Nikita Khrushchev, who began the process of de-Stalinization, where he would remove the strict control and paranoia felt throughout the USSR and its satellites during Stalin's reign. In 1955, the admission of West Germany to NATO and the Austrian State Treaty prompted Khrushchev to create the Warsaw Pact, an eastern version of NATO, which also allowed the USSR to justify the presence of Red Army troops in Eastern Europe and worry the West. De-Stalinization led to protests and the removal of Hungary's communist government in July 1956, replacing it with a nationalist and socialist government that October. When the new Hungarian leader, Nagy, announced Hungary's neutrality on November 1st, 1956, the USSR sent in its troops to crush the revolution, which it did in 1 week. These events showed what the USSR might do to any country attempting to leave its sphere of influence, and painted Khrushchev's Russia as a brutal regime. These crises unfolded. The arms race continued, with the USA in the lead at the beginning of the 1960s. So, what might you be asked in an exam on the Cold War? There are generally three kinds of questions asked in this section of the Edexcel exam. There is an 8-mark question asking you to explain two consequences of a particular event. For example, explain two consequences of the use of atomic bombs against Japan in August 1945, and that's 8 marks. Secondly, there will be a narrative question asking you to recount events in chronological order, that is, the order in which they happened. These questions are also worth 8 marks. Narrative questions will always provide 2 bullet points, which can give you a hint about what you might write about, but you don't have to write about these details. You do have to include information that isn't listed as one of these 2 bullet points. An example of a narrative style question is this. Write a narrative account analysing the key events of the Berlin Crisis, 1948 to 1949. You may use the following in your answer. Stalin's fears, the airlift. You must also use information of your own, 8 marks. The third type of question asks you to explain the importance of 2 different ideas or events. You will be able to choose which 2 to write about out of a list of 3. These questions are worth 16 marks, so 8 marks per explanation. An example of this type of question is this. Explain 2 of the following. The importance of the Truman Doctrine, 1947, for the development of the Cold War. The importance of the events in Hungary in 1956 for the development of the Cold War. The importance of the Bay of Pigs incident for relations between the USA and Soviet Union. 16 marks. 16-mark questions will always have options from different topics throughout the Cold War course. So far, we have only covered topic 1, so option 3 regarding the Bay of Pigs incident will not be familiar to you yet. Let's have a go at answering these 3 questions. For question 1, it's asking us to explain 2 consequences of an event, not reasons for the event, but what happened afterwards because of this event. The event it wants us to examine, of course, is the use of atomic bombs against Japan in August 1945. The 2 consequences which come to my mind are Japan's surrender and the Soviet race to create their own atomic bomb. You could also say that the USA emerging as the only nuclear superpower was also a consequence. But we only need two consequences, so let's go with the first two. The next thing we need to look at is the marks, which will give us an idea about how much we need to write for the answer. This question is 8 marks, and we need to explain two consequences. So each consequence will be worth 4 marks. We only need to write one decent paragraph for each consequence to score 4 marks. So how do we structure our answer? It will be in 2 paragraphs. Each paragraph will start by identifying the consequence. Then we'll give some facts and statistics and an explanation of that consequence in more detail. I always give my students 2 pieces of advice for history writing. Number 1, use signposting such as firstly, secondly, or finally at the beginning of each new paragraph. This makes your answer easy to follow and clear for the examiner. Number 2, be direct and to the point. Writing in history is different from writing in English or English literature. You aren't being marked on your vocabulary. What's important is how many accurate facts, dates, names, and statistics you can include in your response. Try to remain professional sounding too, by avoiding I and you and words like stuff. So, keeping all that in mind, here is an example of a good response for question 1. Explain 2 consequences of the use of atomic bombs against Japan in August 1945, 8 marks. One consequence of the USA dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, was Japan's surrender. Prior to the use of atomic bombs against Japan, the USA and Japan had been locked in a drawn-out war across the Asia-Pacific. The USA demanded Japan's unconditional surrender, and after witnessing the destruction of 2 cities on Japan's mainland and 210,000 Japanese deaths without a single US life lost, Emperor Hirohito surrendered on September 2, 1945, bringing an end to the Second World War. The second consequence of the use of atomic bombs on Japan in August 1945 was to energize Stalin's ambition to create a Soviet A-bomb. After the use of atomic bombs in 1945, Stalin wished to match the USA in nuclear strength, both to protect the USSR and to raise the prestige of his country. The USSR used espionage, such as through the nuclear physicist Klaus Fuchs, to steal US secrets and speed up the process of making its own nuclear bomb. Stalin also utilized the Soviet command economy and millions of prisoners in the gulags to produce the resources to create such a weapon. The USSR detonated its first atomic bomb on August 29, 1949. In this example, you will notice the following. Each paragraph starts with a simple sentence to introduce a consequence and link it to the question. I've used many specific dates, names of places and people, and statistics. I've explained how the use of nuclear bombs led to these consequences. I've used the phrase, the second consequence, to signal to the marker that I'm moving on to the next point. I haven't used words such as you or I. I haven't used many fancy words or emotional language because I'm not arguing a point like in English. I'm simply stating the facts and explaining them. I highly recommend having a go at answering these questions yourself, and also timing yourself. This will give you a feel for the speed and amount of writing required for different questions. This way, you will also become aware of what you definitely know and what you need to revise a bit more. Let's move on to question 2. For narrative questions, it's especially important not to confuse narrative with story. Once again, a history answer isn't a creative writing piece. In history, a narrative simply means retelling the events in the order they happened in. You must still remain neutral and use facts and statistics. Question 2, which is also worth 8 marks, I will include one strong paragraph and one weaker paragraph so you can see the difference more clearly. The question we've been given is, write a narrative account analysing the key events of the Berlin Crisis 1948 to 1949. You may use the following in your answer. Stalin's fears, the airlift. You must also use information of your own, 8 marks. We don't have to include Stalin's fears or the airlift in our response, but we have to include information other than these 2 details. For my answer, I will include the Berlin airlift, but I won't include Stalin's fears. I will also write about the Federal Republic of Germany. This answer has to be in chronological order. Because the creation of West German currency came before the Berlin blockade, I will start with that. Opposition to the economic recovery or reunification of Germany, mainly by France and Russia, led to a stalemate in the immediate post-war era, as tensions between the Soviet East and capitalist West rose. In 1947, even after 43 meetings, the old Grand Alliance could not agree on how to deal with German recovery. In 1948, Clement Attlee and Harry Truman agreed with France's Charles de Gaulle that German economic recovery would be balanced by a similar rise in German exports to France. It was with this agreement that France agreed to join its zone with the UK and USA in the spring of 1948, introducing a West German federal government and new West German currency. On June 24, 1948, Stalin reacted to this decision by blockading all Western access to Berlin and cutting off the city's electricity. This marked the beginning of the Berlin crisis. The Berlin airlift was when the USA and UK sent planes day and night to help the people of Berlin. It was after Stalin blockaded Berlin. The Berlin airlift lasted more than a year, which is a really long time for the poor people in Berlin who relied on the airlift for all their food and things. Eventually, Stalin gave up the blockade and the USA and UK came out on top, whereas Stalin was humiliated because his plan didn't work. At the end of the Berlin crisis in 1949, West Germany became a country, as did East Germany. Hopefully, you can see from this example that the first paragraph is much stronger than the second one. In the first paragraph, I have told the events in chronological order, used specific dates and the names of important people, and kept my answer relevant to the beginning of the Berlin crisis. In the second paragraph, you can see that the first two sentences are in the wrong chronological order. I've only used one date and it isn't specific. I haven't used specific details, such as the proper names of the German Democratic Republic and Federal Republic of Germany. I used words like things instead of giving details, and I didn't include dates or statistics about the Berlin airlift. This is a great opportunity to try and write a second paragraph on the Berlin airlift that's better than mine. Finally, let's look at the 16-mark question. Usually these questions will have options from different topics throughout the Cold War course, but so far we have only studied topic 1. The question is, explain 2 of the following. The importance of the Truman Doctrine, 1947, for the development of the Cold War. The importance of the events in Hungary in 1956 for the development of the Cold War. The importance of the Bay of Pigs incident for relations between the USA and the Soviet Union, 16 marks. Obviously, we will be choosing options 1 and 2 for this example, since we haven't yet covered the Bay of Pigs incident. Just like in question 1, this question requires us to explain events from the Cold War. However, unlike question 1, this question is asking about the importance of these events, not the consequences of them. So we need to be mindful of that. Secondly, this question is worth 16 marks. So instead of allocating 4 marks for each explanation like in question 1, we need 8 marks each. This means that we need to go into much more detail in explaining our 2 topics. I suggest writing 2 full paragraphs for each explanation. That's 4 marks per paragraph. 4 paragraphs is 16 marks. We will begin by signalling to the examiner which topic we will be answering first. Then we will explain the Truman Doctrine in great detail, paying close attention to its importance for the Cold War. Then we will do the same for option 2, which is about the Hungarian uprising. If you want to challenge yourself, maybe you can pause the video here and answer one or both of the topics before seeing how I answered it. You could do this with notes and without a timer, or in exam conditions if you're feeling confident. Here's my answer. Option A. The Truman Doctrine was President Harry Truman's foreign policy towards the USSR from 1947 onwards. Specifically, the Truman Doctrine was the idea that the United States should stand up against the Soviet Union wherever it tried to spread its influence. Truman announced this policy on March 12, 1947, when he said to the US Congress that The time has come when we must decide that we should resist with all means at our disposal any Soviet aggression, and that it must be the policy of the United States to support free people who are resisting attempted subjugation. The doctrine had come from US Ambassador to Moscow, George Kennan, who wrote in his long telegram in 1946 that the USSR will back down in the face of pressure. The doctrine truly came to life, however, in June 1947, when the US Secretary of State George C. Marshall suggested his plan to fund the rebuilding of Europe in order to counteract Soviet influence in the area. The Truman Doctrine was an important event in the Cold War because it marked a turning point in the USA's relations with the Soviet Union. It marked the shift from cooperation and competition between the USA and USSR during World War II to opposition and animosity. This was felt in the USSR, where Stalin viewed the US Marshall Plan as a threat to his sphere of influence, whereas in November 1944, less than 5 years earlier, Stalin had said that the USSR's alliance with America was vitally important to the Soviet Union's long-term interests. Secondly, the Truman Doctrine was important for Western Europe, which benefited economically and militarily from the USA's efforts to rebuild and revive its economies in an attempt to counteract communist support in the region. Option B. The Hungarian Uprising in 1956 was a popular revolution against Soviet control during the years of de-Stalinization under Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev. De-Stalinization was the process of removing strict control and paranoia used by Stalin to operate the Soviet Union and its satellite states, which Khrushchev saw as counterproductive. In Hungary, the people took this opportunity to remove the harsh communist leader, Matthias Rákosi, replacing him with the previous socialist leader, Imre Nagy, in October 1956. When Red Army troops left Hungary, Nagy announced on November 1, 1956, that Hungary would be neutral and aligned neither to the USA nor the USSR. This led Khrushchev to send in Soviet troops to crush the revolt the following week, leading to 4,000 Hungarian deaths and returning a pro-communist government to power. The Hungarian uprising was important firstly because it spelled out the limits of Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign. It sent a clear message to the rest of Eastern Europe that leaving the Soviet sphere of influence would not be tolerated. But aside from regaining the control of Hungary, the Hungarian uprising was important for the development of the Cold War because of its negative impact on the USSR's prestige. It showed that the Soviet Union's allies were kept in check by force, not willingly, and it demonstrated to the outside world the brutality of the Soviet regime and its reliance on Eastern Europe as a defensive buffer zone. As you can see from these answers, I divided the two responses into two separate paragraphs each. The first paragraph explains the topic, and the second paragraph explains its importance. I make sure to start the second paragraph with words such as, "It was important because." This keeps me focused on the question and not to get sidetracked by talking about consequences or causes instead. This is a very good way to structure your response and to keep your thoughts calm and ordered during the exam. It also helps the examiners who are better able to see the points you are making. Also note that my answer here was not in chronological order, which is okay. Only in narrative questions do you have to retell events chronologically. In the next lesson, we will begin topic 2 by looking at the situation in Berlin during Khrushchev's leadership. Thanks for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time on GCSE History Lessons.